Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is the Raptor, and yes, I'm finally gonna talk about this. In case anyone's forgotten or just doesn't keep as close track of Death Battle behind the scenes, those who donated $500 or more to the Kickstarter last year were given the unique opportunity to literally pitch a matchup directly to the Death Battle crew. And while this obviously has no immediate bearing on the official episodes, it has sparked some interesting discussions amongst community members, and it's cool to think about what this could all lead to eventually. So to combat my constant fear of missing out, I will also share which of these matchups I would consider to be my favorites, and even just the ones I'm most intrigued by otherwise, at least for the time being. Now, I feel like there are a couple big things I need to preface before I start rambling about fictional matchups. First, I do not believe a complete list of the pitched ideas is set to be released by the Death Battle team, otherwise I would have waited for that to make this video. I'm going off of the shared document that lists all of the pitches that we know of. There's a link in the description if you want to see it, but there's always a chance more things could get updated or revealed later on. No matter what happens though, I wanted to move forward with this sooner rather than later. If we're never getting an official full list, then why not? Especially considering the crazy amount of matchups we already know of. There's over 250 of them to choose from. And that ties into another important note. Just because I don't bring up a specific pitched idea here, it doesn't mean I'm unaware of it, and it definitely doesn't mean I hate it. I just have to limit this to the fights I want to bring up the most for the sake of time, and some of them I know I just don't have anything really to say about. But still, having donated the money to the Kickstarter to pitch something in the first place is awesome in and of itself. So thank you to all of the pitchers for helping us save Death Battle, and before anyone asks, I probably would have pitched Dark Willow vs. White Violin if I had that kind of money lying around, but hey, at least the crew got to see it on Ballot Banter. Okay, now that we're done with all of that, on with the show. So if I was literally answering the question, what are my favorite matchups that got pitched, technically those would be what fall under my top 50 most wanted death battles list. But I've already talked about those ideas so much at this point, and I feel like they're not the ones that need the extra attention today. So for the sake of completion, they are listed from lowest to highest: Henry Stickmin vs. The Second Coming, Naruto vs. Luffy, Finn and Jake vs. Mordecai and Rigby, and the really big ones, the Eds vs. the Warner from Animaniacs, and Sackboy vs. Maxwell. So not that many, but those are my absolute most wanted out of the pitches, listed briefly for anyone who happened to not know. But now let's talk about some other ones I like that I've only briefly discussed before and not beaten to death by now. Arguably most prominent, Toru and Wonder of You vs. SCP-096. This one has truly exploded, and for good reason. It's such a perfect two sides of the same coin matchup, as I've said previously. Also, Kurumi Tokusaki vs. Homura Akemi may not have gotten more popular for the right reason, but it remains a really entertaining and badass concept. Luz vs. Anne really just goes without saying at this point. There are other cartoon fights I like significantly more, but I definitely can't ignore the prospects or style of this one. Same with Aku vs. the Lich. I know Aku also has him from the Powerpuff Girls, but I think both matchups have similar appeals to each other and could be a very fitting cartoon villain fight. Guts vs. Claire has quite similar appeals to Guts vs. Dimitri, so ideally I'd want to wait a while before we get there, but it's still raw as hell. And Zim vs. Crypto is so charming to me. It basically does for me what Plankton vs. Mr. Mind does, but in a probably better matchup by most accounts, so I would be so down for it. Some of these matchups naturally go hand in hand with each other, like Emmett vs. Jesse and Steve vs. Terrarian. At this point, I think those are my definitive preferred ideas for Emmett and Steve respectively. Some were also in my latest Death Battle Dream Season video, like Moon Knight vs. Azrael, which I've brought up a ton, Loki vs. Kefka, which has grown on me a lot this year, and Lucy Heartfilia vs. Alir. Although I know Lucy vs. Yuna from Final Fantasy was also pitched, which sounds cool too. There are a few Halloween ideas I've mentioned, such as the Universal movie Monsters Battle Royale, Pinhead vs. Tallman, and I guess technically Luigi vs. Pac Pac-Man 2, I've gone back and forth on this one a lot. Sometimes I prefer this, and sometimes I prefer Luigi vs. Shaggy, which was also pitched. And on a similar note, I have very mixed feelings about Donkey Kong vs. Crash Bandicoot. It has its strengths as well as its flaws, but I think the thing I'd get most out of it is seeing DK come back, to be honest. But whatever, I'll put it as an honorable mention, at least. Now for any matchups I've basically never talked about before on this channel, but I would still consider to be among my favorites of what was pitched. First off, Puss in Boots vs. Mau Mau. This one and Puss vs. Buck Wild are nearly tied for me, but I find this one to be a slightly more interesting conversation, and it's just fun. Tifa Lockhart vs. Makoto Nijima is also high up there for me. As someone who wants to see Tifa get a good episode, I definitely think this could do that job. I think Ness vs. Frisk is cool. I've seen varying opinions on it, but to me it just feels like the obvious pick for both characters if you're really trying to give them a battle. Zamasu vs. Gore feels a little redundant given previous episodes, but this is still one of the best contrast matchups I've ever seen, so I couldn't leave it out. And I don't think Bob Belcher vs. Hank Hill is nearly as good a matchup as, say, Homer vs. Peter, but I actually have a stronger attachment to these characters and wouldn't mind if Death Battle chose to do it at all. Captain Marvelous vs. Kamen Rider Decade I think kicks ass and is such a perfect idea for its genre. Din Djarin vs. Courier 6 is for sure one of the Mandalorian's best matchups and a really good way to introduce Fallout in my opinion. And Doctor Doom vs. Vecna is so unique that I see it as one of the only acceptable ways to bring Victor back again, and plus Dungeons and Dragons. I know both Father and Bellows have a number of opponents being talked about, and I'm by no means against that, but I think this one is very appropriate and could have a good style. And speaking of different opponents, both Scott Pilgrim vs. Travis Touchdown and Scott vs. Naota Nandaba I think are amazing ways to bring that character onto the show, which I would really like personally. And of course there are some sillier ones that I like anyway, like Detective Chimp vs. Howard the Duck, Condiment King vs. Toiletnator, that one's pretty well known by now, and sort of in that camp, Chomper vs. Piranha Plant. I'll be talking more about this one in a later video, but for now I'll say, yeah, it's cool. Now those are technically all my favorites, but I also wanted to reserve a final section for the big matchups that look interesting to me, even if I can't slot them as a favorite right now. And at the top of that list, Omori vs. Room. Yeah, it's okay guys, I didn't forget about it. I think I'd want to look into it a little more to make sure I can say it works as a satisfying death battle production on every level, but at least for now I can't deny how interesting the concept is, and I'd like to see something like this on the show at least. Similarly, Sonic.exe vs. Red, I know some people are cautious about using these kinds of characters, but this doesn't strike me as something Death Battle couldn't pull off in any successful way if they figure it out. Other matchups that got more popular from being a pitch include Flint Lockwood vs. Finn Shepard, something I never would have thought of on my own, but sounds like it could be the most insane thing ever in a good way, and also Flowey vs. the Princess. I'm not the best word on this, but this looks a lot less problematic than Flowey vs. Monica, and I got no preference otherwise, so I'd probably favor this one. As far as the ones I already knew about, Ragna vs. Velvet Crow I think could work really well for both characters and series, even if I don't know them too well personally. Same with Pit vs. Zagreus, which I would prefer over Percy Jackson vs. Zagreus, unless that's the only way Death Battle would be willing to have Percy in an episode. Mayday Parker vs. Jolene Cujo, not a matchup from either franchise I'd prioritize, but it sounds like it could be fun. Null vs. Oryx has a very distinct vibe, and is probably one of the more interesting Destiny matchups I've heard of, and Master Chief vs. Commander Shepard feels like how we should have brought Chief back to the show in the first place. I caught part of the Death Battle cast episodes for both Laios Toden vs. Goblin Slayer and Toru vs. Mao Sadao, and they look like they've both got a lot of potential in their own ways. And finally, a lightning round for the ideas I really got nothing to say about but still pique my interest a little bit. Flash Gordon vs. Buck Rogers, Satan from Devilman vs. Hades from Saint Seiya, Jibanyan vs. Morgana, Mojo Jojo vs. Spectre, and Jet the Hawk vs. Nitrous Oxide. I don't know if that last one's actually good, I just think it's funny. And okay, this feels like a good place to call it. As I said earlier, these are just the main matchups I like or catch my interest right now. I'm happy that all the pitchers got to share an idea they were passionate about. Of course, you're more than welcome to share which ones you like the most as well, and more than welcome to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. But no matter what, thank you so much for watching, hope you have a great day, and I'll see ya when I see ya. Peace out.